Oz Perkins' 2024 film Longlegs was pretty divisive upon release, with the hype built up from the marketing reaching levels that very few horror movies can manage, promising a dark and nasty serial killer thriller a la Silence of the Lambs. And that's really not what Perkins had cooking up. Now, of course, I'm not blaming all of the dislike towards Longlegs on the marketing, but there's definitely something to be said for the fact that Perkins had nothing to do with it, and while those teasers, trailers, and the ARG were fantastic in a vacuum, they definitely set up something that was quite a ways off from the movie that was waiting at the end of the campaign. While we were told to expect this...
Do you think if you save poor Catherine, you could make them stop, don't you? You think if Catherine lives, you won't wake up in the dark ever again?
What we wound up getting was this.
Daddy! Mommy! Unmake me! And save me from the hell of living!
You can call me birthday girl, because I'm all here for it.
The almost birthday girl.
Longlegs tells the story of Lee Harker, a homicide detective played by Micah Monroe, who becomes intertwined with a mysterious string of murders as she tries to hunt down the man behind it all, only known by the name that he writes in the esoteric letters he leaves behind at the murder scenes. This was Oz Perkins' fourth feature film as a director, with The Black Coat's Daughter, I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House, and Gretel and Hansel coming before, but this was certainly the first time that any of his films had as much attention on them as this one did. Part of that was undoubtedly the fact that Nicolas Cage was in the role of Longlegs, and anyone with a functioning head on their shoulders is sure as hell gonna be drawn in by the idea of Nick Cage playing a crazy satanic serial killer, especially when he talks like this.
Oh, there she is.
That line delivery haunted me for months after hearing it in one of the many very vague and ominous teasers that Neon put out, and every time I hear it, I feel two pretty conflicting emotions. On the one hand, I was so excited at the idea of seeing the movie that was being sold to me in these teasers, and there's a tinge of disappointment when I think about how badly I wish that movie existed, because it was gonna be amazing. But on the other hand, I can't deny that Longlegs was one of my favorite movies from 2024, and I especially can't deny that I only find myself liking it more and more as time has gone on, and the thoughts of what could have been have faded away, allowing me to fully appreciate the vision. I have been getting lots of requests for a deep dive on this one since it released, but even if no one had mentioned it, I would still be making this video because there's just so much to say about Longlegs. So, if you don't mind.
Let me in now, and it can be nice.
The film's opening is something that I'll really never forget, and like with the movie as a whole, there are a bunch of smaller details that I didn't even notice the first time around that I've gone on to appreciate a lot. One of which comes only just as we're actually getting into the world of Longlegs, with the crimson red wall fading away into the snow, making the world look bathed in the sinister light of hell and showing how the story is rooted in the satanic. The thing that I've really come to appreciate about Longlegs is how well it commits to a very dense, uncanny, strange, and at times intentionally awkward tone. This is a very weird feeling movie that leans into discomfort in a way that I don't think has been done for a very long time, but it's not so much the what I'm seeing is so messed up and I don't like looking at it sort of discomfort that, you know, something like The Human Centipede is. It's more so, I really don't know what the fuck I'm supposed to be feeling now, because if I was a kid in my yard by myself and this creepy looking fuck came up to me and started doing this,
It seems I wore my long legs today. What happens if
I'd be absolutely terrified out of my mind and wouldn't feel safe for the rest of my life. But also, it's kind of making me laugh in a sort of awkward, nervous way because it's Nicolas Cage looking like this, randomly breaking into song with the confidence of someone who thinks no one is listening. It's that sort of uncomfortable. I'm actually really glad that the movie starts with a scene that shows this tone, because it let me just drop my expectations for what I thought the movie was going to be right off the bat, and I'm sure I enjoyed it more than I would have if they'd kept this sort of thing hidden and made me think I was actually getting something else. There is so much to unpack with this scene and so many reasons that it's such an effective opening. It's really in the sound design where I feel like this does the best job, with the lack of score making this young girl's footsteps sound so lonely and vulnerable. The distant loon calls, which by the way is the most hauntingly beautiful sound in the natural world, and you can fuck right off if you say anything else.
Loons suck.
You can fuck off is what you can do. Then of course, it's the bone-chilling call from Longlegs himself. Before we get too much into the film's story, I want to talk about some of the technical craft here, because the visuals and the sound in this movie are so ridiculously good. As I was saying, there's a very uncomfortable and weird feel here, and part of that is the way that Perkins refuses to ever make you feel like you have a full grasp on the things you're looking at. A lot of this movie was shot using pretty wide lenses, which gives a bit of distortion to the frame, but also gives a lot of screen real estate that Perkins makes very good use of by filling it with so much to look at. The movie often looks like a police bulletin board with these connected clues trying to find a common purpose, and it's like you're being tempted to analyze every inch of the frame, look through every doorway for something lurking in another room or some marking on a spot tucked away in a corner. And usually there's nothing there, and that feeling that you've missed something keeps lingering because you can't shake the thought that maybe while you were looking there, something happened over here that you weren't paying attention to. When there is actually something to find hiding in the frame, there's a creative decision that I absolutely adored, where it'll often very quickly fade away so you don't get a chance to acquaint yourself with it, almost making some of these images feel like things that you're projecting onto the screen that aren't actually there. This isn't just something that's applied for things in the background, it's also employed for more direct images, like the unbelievably creepy sight of the sinister face of the doll under this black veil, where when the shot begins, you can't see any of the facial features, and then they slowly reveal very subtly, but it cuts almost as soon as you realize it's happened, so you can't acquaint yourself with it. There's this great underlying sense of something foreign in the air that's constantly watching from the shadows, and this sort of vague visual technique really helps in making that feel like an actual presence. The overall look of this movie is a sort of sickly, haunting rendition of a Southern Gothic aesthetic, with the very dark palette that's brought to life by choosing to film largely in low light places with dark colors, and then going with this amber lighting. It just makes everything feel so isolating and uncomfortable, and when we do see daylight, it's generally very cold and dead, so we're held from ever getting any proper sense of warmth or comfort. It's such a good looking movie from start to finish, and one of the best things about it is how believable and realistic the nighttime scenes are. Now, to be fair, if you're watching this during the day or in a room with some light in it, it can be pretty difficult to make some things out in these scenes because they are so dark. But if you're in a dark enough room, these scenes are absolutely incredible and capture the actual feeling of nighttime in a way that made me realize how rare it is for night to actually look like night in movies. Of course, there's a good reason to get some more light into these scenes, but I love looking at the isolated forest roads or farmhouses with that feeling of not being able to make out detail in certain things, but just seeing the vague blobbish outlines of them, like these dark figures stretching out over the horizon. I just love the very dark, naturalistic look of the film, but because of these hints throughout the frame, you're also reminded of the fact that something much darker is seeping into this world. A lot of those little things I missed on my first viewing in the theater, which I think is partially because the screens near me aren't all that great and these images can be pretty subtle, but it's also just because of how your vision is almost intentionally guided away from these things to make you miss them. The craziest one to me that I didn't even notice until my second viewing at home is that you can literally see the shadow of the devil standing directly behind Lee here, but it almost blends in such a way that I just totally missed it in my peripheral and was locked on the much more obvious point of focus with Lee's face. Every environment here feels captured with so much care, and a lot of that is thanks to the production design from Danny Burnett and set decorations from Trevor Johnston, especially with things like the basement that Longlegs turns into his lair. There's this deeply unsettling dreaminess to these locations, and they do a great job of setting off every single alarm bell in your brain without even having Longlegs present. I could see this in any context and immediately feel like I'm not safe, and that sort of production design goes a very long way. The sound is another super important part of this movie. It's very subtle and quiet most of the time, which makes those moments when things get louder feel so jarring and unsettling because it's pushing past the comfort level that the film establishes. Phone calls are quiet and distant, conversations are had softly in dark rooms, and the soundscape itself is this swooshing array of sort of deceptively peaceful disorientation, like the feeling of being homesick in the mid-afternoon when the rest of the world is out of their houses and the air sounds so quiet. The score was done by Zilgi, or Zilgi, I'm not exactly sure, who is actually Osgood's brother Elvis Perkins, and the soundtrack that he delivered is this deeply unsettling mixture of swirling synths and rumbling sound design with these occasional explosions of really disturbing and distorted wobbly string sections that, like how the louder moments of this movie pop more because of the overall crawling tone, feel so much more impactful because of how carefully placed they are. When you're used to hearing like sort of liminal rumblings, these witchly strings pierce through in such a powerful way, and they do a great job of evoking a sense of, this is really bad, run now, this is really bad. Aesthetically, this movie is honestly a triumph, with the caveat being that it would probably be pretty hard to fully take in the scenery if you're not in an ideal viewing environment, but the whole sensory side of things is just so fucking good. It's this eerie, uncanny, and dark dreamscape that I've appreciated more every time I've seen the movie. In terms of the characters, we've got an interesting situation with this one because our vessel for this story is Lee Harker, who doesn't really have any close connections with anyone, so there aren't many proper relationships to get invested in. She has her co-workers with whom she has little more than a professional relationship with, her mother, who's damn near catatonic and far away all the time, so there's no sense of deep connection there, and there's Longlegs. And that one's not such a healthy dynamic either. She's a very isolated lead character, which means that our emotional investment in the story hinges almost entirely on Maika Monroe's performance to give some life to Harker. And thankfully, it's Maika Monroe, so she does. Also, I love that nod to Dracula with her being named Harker. Awesome. Lee is very quiet and often uncomfortable interacting with other people, only showing real fire when she's diving into her work or on her own, and I do think that a part of this is because of the influence that her connection to Longlegs has on her psyche, but it's also important to note that Monroe was intentionally playing the character as someone on the spectrum. I'll admit that the first time I saw the movie, I thought her character was pretty bland. She was honestly my main point of criticism, and I'll also admit when I'm wrong. Lee is not at all a bland character, and when I heard Monroe talk about how she approached the role and thought more about the movie's story, the decisions here made so much more sense. There's this beautiful subtlety to the performance that Monroe brings, making it so that Lee is someone that's so easy to care about and get invested in when you can see the cracks of her personality shining through.
How'd you figure that out?
I only looked long enough, sir.
Of course, we'll get more into this in a bit, but part of the story here is that Lee's body is not entirely her own, and her mind is sort of being trapped somewhere else. And there's a little detail that's brought up when she's talking with a young girl who asks what she wanted to be when she got older.
Did you want to be an FBI agent when you were a little girl?
No. I actually wanted to be an actress.
I love this answer because it does the very important job of making Lee feel way more than just the quiet, lonesome woman we see throughout the movie, but also because of what's implied by that. With her mind essentially being trapped and held hostage, I love the idea of her being drawn to a career where she can pretend to be someone else, because she very likely feels like part of herself is missing and she doesn't quite know how to navigate interacting with people. So the thought of being able to become another person and fill her head with the experience of someone else is a really great way of very quietly giving us more of her personality without some big exposition dump about it. Not that this movie is particularly shy of exposition dumps. More on that later. There's a sadness to Lee that's emphasized by just how alone she seems, and there's this sort of wishing quality to the scenes when she's on the phone with her mom where she's trying to hold on to the one connection that's actually been there throughout her life, but it's one that really doesn't give back, and when it does, it's not in the way she needs.
You're not a child because you were allowed to grow up.
Allowed?
This is a cruel world.
The detail of her being afraid of her prayers is another that I really liked because it makes it seem like either the part of herself that's held hostage by the devil is coming out here, making her uncomfortable with praying to God, or that there's some strange feeling she gets when she thinks about the things she's saying in her prayers that are like she's being reminded of something that she can't remember and doesn't want to. She's also able to decode the letters that Longlegs leaves behind, which of course is partially because she's a damn good detective, and when she works, there's a focus unlike anything we see from her in other parts of the movie, but it's also because she has an intrinsic understanding of this sort of thing with her connection to this whole situation that she's not even aware of yet. I really appreciate how the movie lays these sorts of things out but doesn't point straight at them. She's also psychic, with the scene after the cold open showing how she knew that the killer they were looking for was in a specific house, and she's proven right almost immediately.
Hi there. Hi, I was wondering if you take a look at that for me.
I do like, though, that she's not treated as some sort of superhero with magic abilities where she's always getting this stuff right, because a lot of the times she doesn't, and there's still a lot she's not aware of. With this sort of thing, properly balancing it is very important, because a psychic detective can get really cartoonish if you're not careful. It also works because there's an actual reason that she's able to figure things out like this, and it's directly tied into the story. In terms of side characters, there isn't really all that much to talk about, honestly. We have Agent Carter, who's been working on the Longlegs case but hasn't been able to crack it, and he's sort of just your standard homicide detective in a movie who's glad to see that Lee is around because she's made so much progress on it so quickly.
You know, last week this investigation is ice cold. Then you come on to it and all of a sudden it's flowing like, I don't know, hot lava.
His family does play a more important role at the end of the movie, but he's mostly here to give another driving force to the investigation and have a partner for Lee to work alongside. I wish they'd spent more time fleshing him out beyond his role in the case, because that final scene would have so much more emotional weight to it if we'd been given more to get invested with him and his family. His wife and daughter show up early on in the movie and then can be completely forgotten until pretty much the very end, so one or two additional moments where we get to feel that family more beyond their faces would have gone a long way here. I do like the scene that Lee shares with Carter's daughter, but it's there more so to give Lee some extra depth and not so much Ruby. Then there's Lee's mother, Ruth, who we don't meet until quite a while into the movie after hearing her on phone calls a couple of times, where Lee goes back home to question her about some things from her past that would explain why Longlegs is focused on her. Ruth is very distant, and it's a bit of a weird situation because there's a good reason for why she is, but she's another example where it feels like there's just not much to her character beyond the role she has to play in the story. Like, she's sort of just a vessel for certain plot points and not much else. Alicia Witt does a very good job of playing this disconnected character who feels like she's always got one foot in some other place, but I think it's the biggest example of this movie really not having much connective tissue between the characters. There are some small details that I really appreciated that add some much needed dimension to her, like how she kept Lee's baby teeth from when she was 10, sort of indicating how when Longlegs came into their lives and turned everything upside down, Ruth was sort of trying to pause time in her own head and hold on to her daughter still being young.
I might have forgotten everything I possibly could, for both of our sakes, but I never threw anything away.
She refuses to throw things away and still refers to Lee as a little girl, which is probably part of what she's had to lock herself into to allow her to carry out some of the acts that she swore she would. Lee's room is even left exactly as it was when she was a kid. We do see a bit of another side to her during some of the flashbacks from before she was taken over, but these moments are quite fleeting and not all that revealing of anything beyond what you'd expect, so they don't really add a whole lot. It does make sense that I never really felt like Ruth was Lee's mother, since Ruth is barely a person at this point, so I don't really think it's a negative in and of itself. It's just sort of a part of a broader feeling that no one in this movie is very connected. There's this feeling of anyone aside from Lee, Longlegs, and I suppose Ruth not being much more than set dressing, but again, we are experiencing this story through the lens of someone who doesn't tend to make deeper connections with people and is very alone, so it does make sense. It also doesn't feel like the intention here was to make a deeply emotional story, so they set up the archetypes they needed and let them serve their purpose of building the foundation for Perkins to then tell the story he wanted to, and I can respect that.
Knock, knock on the farmhouse door. A nice lady with a Bible and a congratulations, you have been selected.
You want to know something? I instantly lose respect for anyone who doesn't like Nicolas Cage. I believe in emphasizing subjectivity in discussion, but this is one place where it's an inarguable, objective fact that Nicolas Cage is an absolute god who has not once, not one time, ever delivered a line poorly, questionably, or in a way that feels way too over the top for the context.
I never misspelled anything! Not once, not one time!
You tell him, Nick.
You're Nick fucking... Whoa, Cage!
Yeah.
How'd it get burned? How'd it get burned? How'd it get burned? How'd it get burned?
Uh-huh.
I have to come back, not once, not twice, but as many times as I like.
Nicolas Cage is one of the most beautifully bizarre actors that we have, and I think a lot of people forget that the dude is an Oscar-winning actor. If you give him the right material and let him be Nicolas Cage, you're gonna get a result that you can't get from anyone else. And Longlegs is pretty much a perfect role for what he does well.
The Cameron family farmhouse will be so bright and white, you can't miss it.
This is easily one of his strongest performances, despite looking like Leatherface from The Next Generation after 4 decades of chain smoking and listening to psychedelic rock. Longlegs is essentially the embodiment of what I was talking about when I said how this movie is leaning into the uncanny and uncomfortable in a way that I don't see done very often, and it's largely thanks to how good Nick Cage is at this sort of unhinged performance that it works so well. In the hands of someone else, this could easily be cheesy and silly and dumb, but I really don't feel that here at all. It's very tricky to make this sort of extremely over-the-top and unhinged thing work well within the context of a dark story like this, and not have it ruin the whole tone, and there are all of these little things about the performance that make that balance successful. A huge part of that is his voice, which was the really big thing that made me so excited.
What day is your birthday, little angel?
When I first heard his voice in one of the teasers, it sent chills down my spine in a way that very few things can. It's this disturbingly excited tone that really gets to me, where it feels like he just can't wait for things to play out. What's really interesting to me is the way my feelings during his scenes have changed each time I've watched the movie. Usually the more you watch something, the less frightening it becomes, because a huge part of fear is the unknown. So when you've seen a movie and you know how it all plays out, it can be harder to get scared by it. But I've had the opposite experience with this character. He made me very uncomfortable the first time around, but each time I'm finding myself more and more unsettled by Longlegs, and that's really exciting to me. Everything about him is just wrong in the best way possible, and while I can definitely see why some people find it silly and aren't into it, when I sit and really immerse myself in what I would feel like if I was watching this guy in person and not in a movie, scenes like his police interview tape start to make my skin crawl.
And you'll be there. And you'll be there. And you'll be there.
There's no part of this dude that is capable of functioning in society, but the fact that he just doesn't care and keeps on going and knows he's going to win is creepy as all hell. One of the things that I thought was a bad idea in the marketing before I even saw the movie was how they were using the comparison some outlets made to Silence of the Lambs as a way to say that Longlegs is like that movie. Hell, they put it on the cover of the fucking Blu-ray, and that was a terrible idea. Not only because Silence of the Lambs is like an all-timer, and no movie should ever try and compare itself to something like that because it needs to happen naturally, but also because in a lot of ways, this movie's killer is the polar opposite to what you'd find there. Those were smart and cunning killers who knew how to manipulate people and felt like they had everything under control. And Longlegs seems like a huge loser who got involved in Satanism and hangs out in his basement. There's obviously more that separates these two movies, but I did enjoy how this sort of flipped that archetypal serial killer on its head and made him kind of pathetic in a lot of ways. The scene with Lee interrogating him is definitely a highlight of the movie, and it's cool that they didn't let Micah Monroe see Nicolas Cage in makeup until they actually shot this, because her reaction of fear when she goes into the room here is genuine. One of the most terrifying ideas to me has always been that there's some hidden plan that's been designed and executed around you without you ever knowing about it. And this scene leads so heavily into that feeling of being plotted against and told that you really don't have any control because all the groundwork was laid before you were even aware anything was happening. And then to kill off the titular character of the film at the end of the second act is a nice way of throwing your understanding of things out the window. It comes at the perfect time too, because this is when it's becoming more and more clear that while Dale Ferdinand Cobble may have been quite involved in what's going on, he's not the head of the snake. When you've got a character this unsettling and frightening, and then reveal that he's not even the one in control, it's a great way of elevating the sense of panic going into the third act. This dude is very likely someone who was a loner for his life and then took solace in satanic worship as something that made him feel more connected, and he was then taken over and turned into a sort of vessel to aid in playing out Satan's plans to commit these sadistic acts. Cobble never directly kills anyone in the movie aside from himself, only playing the part of making these dolls that are conduits for Satan's influence to take over a family. Essentially how this all works is that Cobble infuses his dark magic into these metal balls, which act as a place for Satan to reside in the heads of these dolls that are given to the families. The dolls are modeled after their kids, trapping their minds, and the devil is then able to influence the family and cause them to basically take themselves out in deeply sadistic ways. Lee's mother is also involved in this whole thing as a part of a deal that she made with the devil to keep Lee alive when she became one of Cobble's targets, where she would be the one who delivered the dolls to the families and make sure it all played out the right way. Wow, Evan, what a boring and stale recap of the story. You know what? I agree. And the movie does the same goddamn thing, albeit with more atmosphere and a better artistic flair. This is where things get frustrating with this movie, because I think that this story is really interesting, but the way we learn about it is through a massive exposition dump right at the end. The whole time we're working through this mystery and trying to put all the pieces together and make sense of things, and instead of having this information be revealed to us throughout the movie, it's all dumped in one long monologue that plays out when Lee's memory is freed from the trap in the doll, and it all comes flooding back to her, which in a movie steeped in so much mystery is a huge disappointment. We could have had just a brief scene of Cobble imbuing one of those balls with dark magic, even just placing one on a sigil or whispering a prayer, or however they wanted to handle that. He could have briefly mentioned how he gave the devil eyes to watch the horrors play out during the interrogation scene, and that would have made it pretty clear that those metal balls were how Satan got to sit in the dolls. This part really sticks out to me because they get so close to letting this reveal itself more naturally when Cobble says this.
I know you're not afraid of a little bit of dark. Because you are the dark.
They needed like one more additional line from Cobble during the interview, and it didn't need to be some overly expository thing. Just one nod about him giving eyes to the devil so that he could sit back and enjoy the torment, and this whole thing would be cleared up without being heavy-handed. Ruth could have killed Agent Browning and destroyed the doll that's locked away Lee's memory of what happened, and then Lee, now knowing something that we don't, could find Cobble's lair in Ruth's basement, which could provide some great environmental storytelling, and she could then go to Carter's house as she does. Her panic in rushing there after getting the phone call would be such a great hook because we haven't had it all spelled out yet. Also, I do wish that the phone call had a less generic demon voice. It would have been more chilling as some stoic mumbling, at least to me. She could then confront her mother about her role in all of this and what she did, and this is where things would start to make more sense. The issue is that by the time we get to the climax, we already have all of the information, so there isn't anything else to reveal here, but if it was structured more like what I'm talking about, then there would be a more captivating feel to this final scene because we're still connecting the dots. I also think this could have been a way more impactful scene if Ruth wasn't in this near catatonia the whole time, where there's more of an emotional conflict of her feeling like she needs to see this through. It would make the dynamic between her and Lee way more tragic if there were the three sides of Lee needing to protect Ruby, Ruth wanting to protect Lee, but Ruth also feeling terrible about what she has to do. When Lee shoots Ruth here, from her perspective, it's sad, sure, but I never really feel the tragedy of it because these characters are too emotionally muted to actually make it work. This is far and away my biggest issue with this movie. The way that this is structured feels like Perkins got to the end of the script and then realized there were no seeds planted, and so it just all got dumped in a huge expository scene and rushed through to the ending. It's frustrating here because Longlegs is honestly one of my favorite horror movies of the 2020s so far, but then it feels like there was no effort put into this mystery unraveling in a more compelling way, and they instead decided to take the most disappointing possible route to revealing it. This story is really interesting too, but it feels underdeveloped and lacking in emotional context because of how dead everyone involved is, and it just falls flat on its face with how it's revealed. I really like the ending itself, with it closing on such a bleak note of Lee being forced to shoot her mother in the head while the devil stares blankly at this horrific thing that it accomplished. Having someone kill their mother on their birthday. It's a really chilling ending where Lee is unable to shoot the doll, which means that Ruby's mind is still going to be locked away, at least for now, and that's where it closes off. Side note, this line that Carter says before killing his wife in the kitchen is so creepy and so well delivered.
I'm so sorry. I'll be right back.
No, I'll be right back. You'll still be in the kitchen.
I know I just went in really hard on this final act, but I still want to be very clear that Longlegs is a movie that I'm enjoying more and more as I continue to revisit it, but it's also one that's narrative structure bothers me more and more because of how they decide to reveal the mystery. It's a weird, disturbing, uncomfortable, and uncanny satanic horror film with some fantastic imagery, a really great subdued lead performance, a perfect role for Nicolas Cage to do what he does best, and an atmosphere that is absolutely oppressive. I just wish there was more effort put into making the narrative something that the viewer could engage with and piece together through more natural storytelling, rather than just being told everything right at the end like we're not capable of figuring it out otherwise. It's the slithering atmosphere and the Satan-worshipping freak that make this movie work as well as it does, but I also can't help but wonder what could have been. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.